23 children were discovered locked in the basement of a Georgia plantation in 1864, all bearing the same distinctive features: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, and auburn hair streaked with gold. When Union soldiers forced open the iron doors of Thornhill Estate in Burke County, they found these children huddled together in darkness, some as young as 4, others approaching adolescence. The eldest, a girl of 13, told the officers something that made veteran soldiers physically ill. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." Military records from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry mention the incident only once, in a letter marked "confidential," and buried in regimental archives for over a century. Local histories of Burke County omit Thornhill Estate entirely, as if the plantation and its mistress never existed. But they did exist. And what Catherine Thornhill created in those 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops represents one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. A systematic breeding program designed to create generations of enslaved people who could never escape their bondage because they were genetically tied to their owner. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Thornhill and the nightmare she built in rural Georgia, I need you to do something. If you're hearing this story and it's making your skin crawl, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel dives deep into the darkest corners of American history, the stories they don't teach in schools, the secrets buried in courthouse basements and forgotten military records. And I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling me what state or city you're in. Are you close to Burke County, Georgia? Does your town have secrets like this buried in its past? Let's find out together. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To a cold February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived a plan that would haunt Georgia for generations. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband was the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. The Thornhill estate sat on 1,700 acres of red clay soil, 7 miles southwest of Waynesboro, the county seat. In 1847, Burke County was cotton country, though not as prosperous as the Black Belt regions further west. The soil here was tired, overworked by decades of single-crop farming. Plantations that had flourished in the 1820s were struggling by the 1840s, squeezed between falling cotton prices and rising costs. The Mexican War had drawn away laborers, and talk of territorial expansion divided communities along bitter lines. Thornhill Estate had once been among the more successful properties in the region. Catherine's late husband, Jonathan Thornhill, had inherited it from his father in 1838, with 42 enslaved workers, adequate equipment, and manageable debt. But Jonathan had been a poor manager and an enthusiastic gambler. By the time a winter fever claimed him in February 1847, the estate was mortgaged to the hilt. The fields were producing barely enough to feed the workers, and creditors were circling like buzzards. Catherine was 28 when she became a widow. She had married Jonathan when she was 19, a strategic match arranged by her father, Theodore Danforth, a prominent merchant in Augusta. The Danforths were old Georgia money, descended from settlers who had arrived in the 1730s. Catherine had been educated by private tutors, spoke French passably well, and had been raised with expectations of managing a substantial household. What she had not expected was to inherit a failing plantation with crushing debts and a 16-year-old son who looked at her with something approaching hatred. Richard Thornhill was Jonathan's son from his first marriage. His mother had died giving birth to him in 1831, and Jonathan had remarried 5 years later. Richard had never warmed to Catherine, viewing her as an interloper who had replaced his real mother. He was a sullen, bookish boy who spent most of his time in the estate's small library, avoiding both his stepmother and the practical work of running a plantation. Catherine found him weak, impractical, and entirely too sentimental about the enslaved workers. He had once suggested they should be taught to read, an idea so dangerous that Catherine had forbidden him from speaking of it again. The plantation itself reflected its declining fortunes. The main house was a 2-story structure of whitewashed brick, with 6 columns across the front portico, built in 1805 in the Federal style. Paint peeled from the window frames, and the roof leaked in 3 places. The furniture inside was a mix of inherited pieces from Jonathan's family and cheaper replacements purchased when the good pieces had been sold to pay gambling debts. Behind the main house stood the kitchen building, the smokehouse, the dairy, and the overseer's cottage, all in similar states of disrepair. Further back, beyond a line of live oaks draped with Spanish moss, were the quarters where the enslaved population